It started as a regular night, a smooth drive home in a brand new luxury car, music low, city lights flashing by. But in an instant, everything changed. Red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror. A routine stop? Maybe. But the moment the officer approached with a smirk and asked, "Whose car is this?" Shaq knew. This wasn't about traffic laws. This was about something else. The accusations came fast. The doubt. The disrespect. A simple question turned into a public spectacle. But what the officer didn't know? He had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and the whole world was about to watch. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city lights gleamed in the rearview mirror as Big Shaq cruised down the boulevard in his sleek, customized luxury car. After leaving an exclusive industry event, he relished the rare moment of solitude. No entourage, no cameras, just him and the open road. Everything felt perfect as he glided through the city, the hum of the engine a soothing rhythm. This car wasn't just a machine, it was a testament to his hard work, his success, his journey. But the atmosphere shifted when a police cruiser appeared in his mirror, its headlights too close for comfort. Shaq remained calm, hands on the wheel, confident he'd done nothing wrong. Still, the cruiser trailed him, turn after turn, until red and blue lights flooded the night. Frustration built in his chest as he pulled to the curb, signaling and turning off the engine. It wasn't the first time he'd faced suspicion simply for driving an expensive car as a black man, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. When the officer approached, Shaq kept his movements deliberate, his tone calm. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's first question struck a nerve. "Whose car is this?" The disbelief in his voice was palpable. Shaq forced a polite reply. "It's mine." The officer's skeptical gaze lingered, his next words cutting deeper. "You got proof of that?" Keeping his patience in check, Shaq reached for the glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid escalating the situation. Even then, the officer's hand hovered near his holster. Shaq handed over his paperwork, watching the officer retreat to his cruiser to scrutinize the documents. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The weight of the situation pressed down on Shaq as a second officer joined the first, whispering phrases that made his stomach churn. "Doesn't add up. Could be stolen." When the first officer returned, his demand hit like a hammer. "Step out of the car." Shaq stared at him, his frustration spilling over. "You serious?" He had provided everything, his ID, registration, proof of ownership. What more could they possibly need? The officer's smirk, a thinly veiled power trip, only added fuel to the fire. "Unless you got something to hide," he taunted. Shaq clenched the wheel, inhaling deeply to calm the storm brewing within. A small crowd began to gather nearby, their phones recording the unfolding scene. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a moment loaded with implications, a moment that could escalate, go viral or worse. It was no longer about his car or the paperwork. It was about the unspoken assumptions, the systemic prejudice he couldn't escape even as a man of success and stature. The night had started with freedom, but now, it felt like a trap, a bitter reminder of how quickly suspicion could strip away dignity. The silence between Shaq and Officer Calloway stretched, thick and weighted. The air felt different now, tense, charged, suffocating. This wasn't a routine stop. Shaq could tell by the way Calloway stood, his shoulders squared, hand resting dangerously close to his belt. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to prove a point. Calloway's eyes flickered across the sleek black luxury car, taking in every polished inch of it, as if it didn't belong in Shaq's possession. The streetlights reflected off the glossy paint, making the moment feel almost surreal. Then, the first words came, and Shaq instantly knew how this was going to play out. "Whose car is this?" Not, "license and registration." Not, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Number he had skipped past protocol and gone straight to accusation. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His voice, however, remained calm. Measured. Controlled. "Mine." Calloway didn't react at first. He just stared, as if waiting for Shaq to trip over his own words, as if expecting a lie. Finally, He gave a slow, exaggerated nod. Yours? His tone was mocking, doubtful, like Shaq had just claimed to own a spaceship. Shaq exhaled, forcing himself to stay patient. That's right. But Calloway wasn't listening. He leaned in slightly, his posture rigid. You got proof of that? Shaq had been through too many situations like this to be surprised. The disbelief, the suspicion, the immediate assumption that a black man in a luxury car must have stolen it. It was tiring. Without a word, Shaq reached toward the glove compartment. Slowly, deliberately. He had learned years ago not to move too fast, not to give them any excuse. But Calloway's hand twitched toward his holster anyway. Shaq's fingers froze inches from the latch. You got a problem? He asked, his voice even but edged with irritation. Calloway narrowed his eyes. Move slow. Shaq clenched his jaw. Move slow. Right. Because pulling out his own paperwork was suddenly a threat. Still, he followed instructions, retrieving his registration and ID and holding them out. Calloway took them without even glancing down. Shaq knew what was coming next. The officer took a step back, turning his attention to his partner, a younger cop named Officer Briggs. Run the plates, Calloway ordered, his tone sharp. Briggs hesitated, just for a second. And in that moment, Shaq saw it. The doubt. The flicker of uncertainty in the young cop's eyes. Briggs wasn't as sure as Calloway was. Shaq caught his gaze through the side mirror, and for a split second, he saw something that looked almost like an apology. But then Briggs nodded and stepped away toward the cruiser. Shaq inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm, collected, unreadable. This was the game they played. Accuse first, force the suspect to prove their innocence. Calloway, meanwhile, took a slow lap around the car, his fingers trailing across the glossy exterior, like he was inspecting a crime scene. Shaq had seen this move before. It wasn't about checking for damage or confirming the plates. It was about power. He turned back to Calloway. Mind telling me what I'm being stopped for? Calloway smirked, folding his arms across his chest. Just making sure everything checks out. That right? Shaq's patience was wearing thin. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you assumed this car doesn't belong to me. Calloway's smirk widened. Just doing my job. Shaq chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Funny, he muttered. Your job seems to start with accusing people instead of following actual procedure. Calloway's expression darkened. What's your problem? He snapped. If the car is yours, you got nothing to worry about. Shaq's eyes flickered toward Briggs, who was now speaking into his radio, probably confirming that the registration matched Shaq's name. But Calloway, he wasn't done. He leaned into the window again, voice dropping to something lower, something meant only for Shaq to hear. How does someone like you afford a ride like this? Shaq's breath hitched. There it was, the real question. Not, is this your car? But how could you possibly afford it? Shaq exhaled sharply, his patience dangerously close to snapping. I work for it, he said, his voice steady but laced with icy restraint. That's how. Calloway let out a low chuckle, like the very idea amused him. Yeah? He said, tilting his head. Doing what? Shaq let the silence stretch, refusing to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Calloway took it as defiance. You sure about that, big guy? He taunted, because I've seen a lot of cars like this, and I've seen a lot of guys like you. And let me tell you, he smiled. A slow, smug, deliberate smile. They don't usually go together. Shaq's blood boiled. He knew what Calloway was doing, pushing, testing, looking for a reaction. But Shaq wasn't about to give him one. Instead, he just smiled back. A slow, knowing, unshaken smile. You done? Shaq asked. Calloway's smirk faltered, just slightly. Then Briggs returned. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. The plates check out, he muttered. Cars registered to him. Silence. Calloway's jaw locked. Briggs glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Shaq's smile widened. Well, he said, raising a brow. Guess that means we're done here, right? Calloway didn't move, didn't speak, didn't admit he was wrong. Instead, he took a slow step back, eyes still locked onto Shaq's, his expression unreadable. Then, he radioed for backup. Shaq's smile vanished. His jaw tightened as the realization hit. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. A sharp voice cut through the night. "Yo, what's going on?" Shaq glanced to his right. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. Calloway noticed too. His eyes flickered to the cameras, and for the first time, Shaq saw something that looked a little like doubt. Or maybe fear. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice low but lethal. "You nervous, officer?" Calloway's nostrils flared, but Shaq? He just sat back, watching the storm he knew was about to come. The air was thick with tension. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the polished black surface of Shaq's luxury car, casting eerie reflections against the nearby storefronts. A crowd had started to gather, their murmurs growing louder as more people stopped to watch. Some held their phones up, recording. Shaq had been through too many situations like this to be surprised. But that didn't mean he was going to sit back and take it. He inhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady, controlled, measured. Am I being detained or am I free to go? His question cut through the noise, directed straight at Officer Calloway, who stood firm, arms crossed, his smirk still in place. "You're not free to go until we figure out whose car this is," Calloway said smoothly, as if he were enjoying the power trip. Shaq's jaw tightened. This was a game, and Calloway was playing it with confidence, knowing that he held all the cards, or at least he thought he did. Shaq refused to break eye contact. "I already told you," he said, voice calm but laced with warning. "It's mine. You have my license, my registration. If you don't believe me, run the plates." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge. For a brief second, Officer Briggs, the younger cop, hesitated. His eyes flicked between Shaq and Calloway, as if debating whether to follow logic or loyalty. Shaq caught that hesitation. Briggs wasn't convinced this was necessary. He wasn't sure Shaq had done anything wrong. But Calloway? He wasn't backing down. Instead, he reached for his radio. Shaq's stomach tightened. This was about to escalate. "Unit 12 requesting additional officers at my location. Possible stolen vehicle situation. Suspect uncooperative." Shaq let out a slow, sharp exhale. Uncooperative. That was the word they always used. Not that he had refused to comply. Not that he had done anything wrong. Just that he had asserted his rights, and for some, that was enough of a threat. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth as if to speak, but before he could, the distant wail of additional sirens filled the air. This was getting out of hand. Fast. Shaq glanced around, noticing how many people were now watching closely. The crowd had doubled in size, drawn by the spectacle of one man versus an entire police presence. And then, live streams began. A young woman near the curb held up her phone, whispering, "Yo, this is crazy. They're harassing him for no reason." A man standing next to her shook his head. "They know who he is. They just don't care." Shaq heard all of it. He felt all of it. Calloway, however, didn't seem fazed by the cameras. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the attention. "You're making a mistake," Shaq warned, keeping his voice firm. Calloway chuckled, amused by the defiance. "Yeah? And what mistake is that?" Shaq leaned slightly forward, his hands still resting on the wheel. "Not running the plates when I told you to." For the first time, Calloway's smirk faltered, just slightly, because deep down he knew Shaq was right. But his ego wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he took a slow step back, tilting his head, studying Shaq like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You got a lot of confidence for a man sitting in a car that doesn't belong to him," Shaq's patience snapped. "You keep saying that," he shot back, his voice finally sharpening. "But you know damn well you haven't checked yet." The crowd murmured louder. Shaq wasn't just defending himself now, he was exposing Calloway's game. And Calloway knew it. Briggs, standing to the side, shifted on his feet. His discomfort was growing. And then, the backup arrived. 3 more police cruisers pulled up, doors flying open as additional officers stepped out. Their hands hovered near their belts, eyes scanning the scene with immediate suspicion. To them, Shaq wasn't a man driving home. He was a suspect, a problem to be dealt with. A slow, simmering anger burned in Shaq's chest. All of this, for what? A traffic stop? A car that belonged to him? The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the crowd's growing frustration. The officers standing beside their cruisers exchanged brief, silent glances, waiting for Calloway's signal, and Shaq realized something in that moment. Calloway didn't want proof. He wanted control, and that was a problem. Calloway stepped forward again, voice dripping with mock concern. "You know, I'd hate for this to get out of hand," he said, loud enough for the cameras to hear. "But you're not really helping yourself right now." Shaq's jaw locked. "I'm not helping myself," he repeated. "I gave you my registration. I gave you my ID. I told you to run the plates. And you're the one who won't do it." The crowd murmured again. Shaq could feel the shift happening. People weren't just watching now, they were witnessing. A woman's voice called out from the sidewalk. "He gave you everything. Why are you still holding him up?" Calloway's expression hardened. Shaq smirked slightly. He didn't like that, did he? Briggs cleared his throat, shifting again. Calloway noticed and turned toward him sharply. "What?" Calloway snapped. Briggs hesitated. Then, after a beat, he muttered, "We should probably just run the plates." Silence. Calloway's face darkened. Briggs wasn't challenging him outright, but it was enough. The tension cracked in the air, so sharp it felt like electricity. Shaq's smirk grew. "Yeah," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a crazy idea. Run the plates." Calloway took a slow breath, his ego visibly wrestling with reason. Then, finally, he caved. With an annoyed sigh, he pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I need a plate check on..." He read off the numbers. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Shaq's heartbeat was steady, because he already knew the outcome. This was his car. He had nothing to fear. And Calloway, he was about to lose. Seconds later, the static buzz from the radio came through. Then, "Vehicle registered to Shaquille Williams. No flags, no alerts, everything's clean." Silence. The crowd erupted. "You see? We knew it!" someone shouted. "Let him go!" Calloway's face turned red. Briggs let out a small breath, as if relieved. And Shaq? He just leaned back, letting the moment sink in. Then, with a smirk, he tilted his head at Calloway. "So, what now?" Calloway's nostrils flared, but he had nothing left, because he lost. The power had shifted. And now? It was Shaq's move. The tension in the air had thickened into something suffocating. Shaq could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, the growing crowd, the officers standing by their cruisers, and most importantly, the camera lenses now capturing every second of this escalating nightmare. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was a moment that could either be buried and forgotten or blown wide open for the entire world to see. And Shaq? He knew exactly what needed to be done. Without breaking eye contact with Officer Calloway, Shaq reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. Calloway's eyes flickered toward the device, and for the first time, something in his posture stiffened. Shaq unlocked the screen, tapped the camera app, and hit record. "All right," Shaq said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Since this officer here doesn't want to follow protocol, let's document everything." The camera's red light blinked to life, and just like that, the game changed. Shaq turned the camera toward himself, the glow from the streetlights casting sharp shadows across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but heavy with undeniable frustration. "It's another beautiful night in the city, and here I am, getting accused of stealing my own damn car." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some cheered in support, others just shook their heads, watching in disbelief. Shaq slowly panned the camera toward Calloway, capturing the officer's smug expression, the very one he had been wearing since the moment this all started. "You see this guy right here?" Shaq continued, the camera locked on Calloway's face. "This is Officer Calloway. He pulled me over, And instead of running my plates like any decent cop would, he just assumed I stole my own damn car. A few voices in the crowd booed. Someone called out, "That's harassment." Calloway's jaw clenched. He finally realized what was happening. Shaq was winning the court of public opinion, and Calloway was about to be exposed on a global scale. "You're not recording me without my consent," Calloway snapped, stepping forward, reaching out as if he could somehow take the phone away. Shaq tilted his head, his smirk cold. "Oh, but I am." He gestured toward the crowd with his free hand. "And so are they." The camera panned back, showing dozens of people holding up their own phones, recording from every angle. This wasn't one video anymore. This was a movement. Calloway gritted his teeth, clearly fighting the urge to react. He knew the second he laid a hand on Shaq, this would turn into a full-blown lawsuit. Instead, he doubled down. "This is a criminal investigation," Calloway announced, his voice loud, as if he was speaking to an audience that would actually believe him. "You're interfering by recording." Shaq let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, that's rich," he said, still holding the camera steady. "You accuse me of stealing my own car, and now I'm the one interfering?" The crowd erupted into shouts of agreement. "Let him go," someone yelled. "This is crazy, man," another voice called out. But then, the moment that changed everything. "Wait a second, that's Big Shaq." The voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd, cutting through the noise like a bullet. A woman in a red hoodie standing near the curb held up her phone. People gasped. Some stepped closer. Others immediately began typing furiously into their phones, no doubt tweeting, posting, and sending out clips in real time. Calloway's face paled. Because now? This wasn't just some guy recording a bad traffic stop. This was a celebrity being harassed. And social media? Social media was about to go nuclear. One of the younger officers standing by a cruiser froze, his hand hovering near his radio as if he had just realized what kind of mess they were in. Officer Briggs shifted uneasily, the lines of stress deepening on his face. And then, another hit to Calloway's ego. Some of the cops recognized Shaq. A few exchanged uncertain glances, as if they suddenly weren't sure how much longer they should be part of this circus. But Calloway? Calloway refused to admit defeat. "That doesn't change anything," he snapped, his voice growing more defensive. "Fame doesn't put you above the law." Shaq's eyes darkened. "No," he said, his tone razor sharp. "But it sure as hell exposes who abuses it." And then, the final straw. Calloway took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "You keep this up," he muttered, just for Shaq to hear. "And I'll arrest you for resisting an investigation." Shaq went still. The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the people recording seemed to sense the shift. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. And then, a sleek black SUV pulled up. The SUV's doors swung open, and out stepped a man in a tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes, and an expression of absolute authority. Shaq didn't even have to turn his camera to know who it was. His lawyer. Calloway's smirk vanished. The lawyer, Bryce Harrington, one of the best in the business, strode toward them, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the situation like a hunter sizing up prey. He barely looked at Shaq before turning his attention to Calloway. "Officer," Bryce said, his voice smooth, but edged with warning. "I assume you have a warrant for this investigation?" Calloway hesitated. Too long. Bryce gave a small, knowing nod. "That's what I thought." He pulled out his phone and held it up. "As of right now, you and your department are being watched by over 50,000 people online. That number is rising by the second." Calloway's shoulders stiffened. Bryce smiled, cold, calculated. "And unless you'd like to spend the next few years fighting lawsuits instead of writing tickets, I strongly suggest you release my client and start thinking about how you'll explain this to your superiors." Silence. The only sound was the distant honk of a car somewhere down the street. Shaq folded his arms, waiting for Calloway to realize that he had just lost. And then, with gritted teeth, Calloway stepped back. You're free to go." Shaq let the words settle before he finally lowered his phone. The crowd cheered. Some clapped. Others jeered at the officers, shaking their heads in disgust. Shaq, however, wasn't celebrating. Instead, he looked Calloway dead in the eye. And then, he smiled. The kind of smile that said, "This isn't over." Because the world had seen everything. And now, Calloway's real problems were only just beginning. The night air had turned thick with anticipation. The once murmuring crowd was now dead silent, their phones raised like a sea of blinking red lights, recording every second of what was unfolding. Shaq stood still, his arms crossed, watching Officer Calloway with an expression that was neither smug nor victorious, just patient. He had already won in the court of public opinion, but now, he wanted the truth. The sleek black SUV sat idling at the curb, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Then, with a measured, deliberate step, Jordan Miles, Shaq's lawyer, emerged from the vehicle. Jordan was a force of nature. 6'2", broad shoulders, tailored navy blue suit crisp under the streetlights. His presence alone was enough to make the tension shift. And Calloway? He knew exactly what was coming. Jordan strode toward them with the calm confidence of a man who had done this dance 1,000 times before. He held a thick leather folder in one hand, his phone in the other, already recording. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Officer." Jordan's voice was smooth, authoritative, and edged with something cold. "You mind telling me exactly why my client is being detained?" Calloway squared his shoulders, attempting to maintain control, but his grip on authority was slipping fast. "There was a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description," Calloway said, his voice firm but lacking conviction. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He flipped open the folder and pulled out official documents, Shaq's proof of ownership. He held them up for everyone to see. "Here's the bill of sale, the insurance records, the registration, the dealership's official statement verifying that this car was purchased by Mr. Shaq, legally." Jordan took a step closer, voice turning sharper. "So tell me, officer, at what point in your investigation did you actually run the plates?" A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Shaq could see Calloway's jaw tighten. Officer Briggs, the younger cop who had been following orders all night, shifted nervously. His hands were clenched at his sides and sweat had started to form along his hairline. Then suddenly, he stepped forward. Briggs leaned in toward Calloway, lowering his voice. But in the dead silence of the street, everyone heard it. "I ran the plates, sir," Briggs whispered, his voice barely audible. "The car's clean. It was never reported stolen." Shaq felt a cold rush of satisfaction course through him. Calloway, however, went rigid. For the first time that night, his confidence cracked. His face paled. His eyes darted toward the crowd, then back at Jordan. Because now, he was trapped. There was no more bluffing. No more pushing his weight around. No more dragging this out under the guise of an investigation. The evidence was right there. The cameras were everywhere. And he was left with two choices. Admit he was wrong, or double down and destroy his own career. Shaq tilted his head slightly, watching Calloway struggle with the weight of his decision. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Even the people in the crowd, some of whom had been loud and vocal minutes ago, were now waiting. Then, Jordan broke the silence. "Well?" he asked, slipping his hands into his pockets. "What's it gonna be, officer?" Calloway clenched his jaw so tightly that Shaq could see the muscles flex under his skin. But he knew. They all knew. This was the moment where his power crumbled, where he could no longer justify his actions, where the entire world would see him for what he really was. His gaze flickered to Shaq, and for the first time since this whole thing started, there was no arrogance in his expression, just panic. Shaq raised an eyebrow, daring him to make the call, daring him to choose whether he was about to make the worst mistake of his career or salvage what little dignity he had left. And finally, Calloway exhaled sharply. Then, without another word, he took a step back. He turned toward Briggs, his voice low and bitter. "Release him." The second those words left his mouth, the crowd erupted, cheering. cheers, laughter. Some even mocked Calloway, shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe he had let it get this far. Shaq, however, he didn't celebrate. He just watched. Because he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Officer Briggs hesitantly stepped forward, unlocking the tension in the air, Calloway's entire demeanor changed. He wasn't just defeated. He was angry. His face burned red, his fists clenching at his sides. And Shaq could tell. This wasn't about justice. This had never been about justice. This was about ego. About a man who had spent years getting away with behavior like this. Until tonight. Until he picked the wrong man to target. Jordan took a step forward, his smirk barely concealed. "Smart choice, officer." Calloway shot him a glare that could have burned through steel. But Shaq? Shaq simply tucked his phone back into his pocket and smiled. Not a smug smile. Not even a victorious one. Just the kind of smile that said, "This isn't the end. This is just the beginning." As Calloway turned, walking back toward his cruiser with rigid movements, the weight of everything that had just happened sank in. His name would be trending within minutes. The footage would go viral before sunrise. His department would be forced to respond. And Shaq? Shaq would be waiting. Because justice was coming. And for once, it wouldn't be in the hands of men like Calloway. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh white glow on the pavement as Officer Calloway stood frozen. His once commanding posture had shrunk into something smaller, something weaker. The weight of the moment, of his failure, his arrogance, and now his exposure, was pressing down on him like an anvil. The cheers from the crowd still echoed in the air, but Calloway wasn't listening. His mind was racing, scrambling for an escape. He needed a way out, a way to spin this, to twist the narrative, to salvage what little authority he had left. And then, like a man grasping at his last lifeline, he spoke. "Look." Calloway started, lifting his hands, palms open, as if he could smooth this over. His voice lacked the smugness it had carried earlier. This was all a misunderstanding. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. "Seriously?" someone shouted. "That's what you're going with?" Shaq, who had remained silent up until now, let out a slow, deep exhale. He had heard this excuse before. Too many times. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice calm but edged with something colder, something final. Calloway nodded quickly, like a man trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Yes. Look, we get a lot of reports about stolen cars matching this description. We were just doing our jobs." Jordan Miles, Shaq's lawyer, stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, his hands still tucked into his suit pockets, but his voice cut through Calloway's excuse like a blade. "Doing your job," he repeated. "By refusing to run the plates. By ignoring the registration when it was handed to you. By escalating a simple traffic stop into a public humiliation." Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. Because there was no answer. Then, the sound of tires screeching. A new car pulled up to the scene, sleek black, unmarked. The doors swung open, and out stepped Captain Howard Reynolds, Calloway's commanding officer. And from the look on Reynolds' face, Calloway's night had just gone from bad to catastrophic. The moment Reynolds saw Shaq standing there, his expression darkened. But when his eyes locked onto Calloway, his disappointment was palpable. "Officer Calloway," Reynolds said, his voice heavy with authority. "Step away from the vehicle." Calloway swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. Reynolds turned to Shaq first, nodding. "Mr. Shaq, I sincerely apologize for this incident. I can assure you, this is not how we conduct proper policing." Shaq, arms still crossed, simply nodded back. Then Reynolds faced Calloway again, his gaze now ice cold. "Hand over your badge and weapon." The crowd erupted. A wave of cheers, whistles, and claps filled the air as Calloway stared in disbelief. "Wait, what?" Calloway stammered. "Sir, this is a... Now." Reynolds' voice was sharp, final. Calloway's hands trembled as he reached for his holster, unbuckling the strap. His power, his authority, was being stripped away in real time. With shaky fingers, he unclipped his badge and gun and placed them in Reynolds' outstretched hand. The moment the badge left his grip, he was no longer a cop. And everyone knew it. The moment was heavy, but it wasn't over yet. Reynolds turned to Officer Briggs, the younger cop who had been reluctant to escalate things, but too scared to go against Calloway. Briggs, now standing stiffly beside a patrol car, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Officer Briggs," Reynolds said, "do you have anything to add before I file an official report?" Briggs hesitated, glancing at Shaq, then at Calloway, then back at Reynolds. Finally, he spoke. "Sir," he started, his voice quieter than before. I ran the plates before this got out of hand. The car was never reported stolen." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Reynolds took a slow, deep breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's trying to contain his fury. "So you knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you still let this happen?" Briggs shook his head, eyes filled with regret. I tried to say something, but Calloway—" "That's enough," Reynolds cut him off. Then, in a move that stunned even Shaq, Briggs turned to face him directly. "Mr. Shaq," he said, his voice shaking slightly but his words firm. "I'm sorry." Shaq stared at him. Briggs's face was pale, his jaw tight, but he meant it. This wasn't just some forced apology, it was genuine regret. Shaq didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded. The crowd had seen enough. People began shouting, mocking Calloway, some calling for further action. And social media? Oh, social media was already on fire. Even before Shaq had put his phone away, his notifications had exploded. Justice for Shaq was trending. Fire Calloway was gaining traction. And the video? The video was already being reposted by celebrities, influencers, and news outlets. This wasn't going away. Calloway knew it too. He wasn't just losing his badge. He was about to lose everything. Shaq exhaled slowly, his frustration still simmering but contained. He could have stayed, could have watched Calloway sink further into the hole he had dug for himself. But he wasn't interested in revenge. He had bigger things to focus on. So, without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, and slid into the driver's seat. Before he could pull away, Jordan leaned down through the open window. "You good?" the lawyer asked. Shaq looked up at him, his eyes unreadable. Then, after a pause, he let out a small chuckle. "I will be." With that, he pulled off, leaving behind the wreckage of Calloway's career and the firestorm that was only just beginning. The video spread like wildfire. By the time Shaq woke up the next morning, his phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, unread messages, and social media notifications flooded his screen. The world had seen everything. The hashtags #Justice for Shaq and #Fire Calloway were trending at #1. Major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens nationwide. Big Shaq accused of stealing his own car, the video that exposed it all. Police officer caught racially profiling celeb, his career is over. Every major platform had clips of the incident. The moment Calloway refused to check Shaq's registration, the second he smirked at Shaq's warnings, the split second his face dropped when Captain Reynolds ordered him to hand over his badge. It was all replayed, analyzed, and discussed by millions. And then came the voices. By noon, celebrities, activists, and politicians had joined the conversation. Public figures tweeted, "This isn't just about Shaq. This is about every black man who's been profiled, disrespected, and harassed. Enough is enough." Famous actor. Shaq had the resources to fight this. But what about those who don't? We need justice for all. Civil rights leader. How many more times will we see this same story? The system is broken. Prominent athlete. Athletes, musicians, and even lawmakers spoke out, calling for immediate action. Some demanded Calloway's arrest, others pushed for police reform. But the one thing they all agreed on? This time, they wouldn't let it slide. As expected, once the internet set its sights on Calloway, they dug deep. Within hours, investigative journalists uncovered a pattern. Past complaints, multiple accusations, reports of misconduct. It turned out this wasn't Calloway's first offense. He had been written up twice for using excessive force. Both cases were quietly dismissed. He had previously pulled over another black man under suspicion of driving a stolen car, only to be proven wrong. Complaints from citizens described him as hostile, aggressive, and power-hungry. But this time, he wasn't getting away with it. As the pressure mounted, reporters flooded Shaq's mentions. They wanted an interview, a reaction, a statement. So later that evening, Shaq finally spoke. He didn't do a press conference. He didn't go on TV. Instead, he recorded a 1-minute video and posted it to social media. Sitting in his home, dressed casually, he looked directly into the camera. His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it you could feel the weight of the moment. "This isn't about me," he began. "This is about every person who gets stopped for looking suspicious in their own car, their own neighborhood. It's about the ones who didn't have a camera, the ones who didn't have a platform, the ones who couldn't prove their innocence before it was too late." He took a deep breath, letting his words settle. "We've seen this happen too many times, and every time we get the same excuses. It was a misunderstanding. We were just doing our job." He looked suspicious. He shook his head. "No more." Shaq leaned forward, his voice firm. "It's time for real change." The video exploded. Millions watched, commented, and shared. It was raw, unfiltered, and powerful. And the world listened. With the pressure mounting, the police department was forced to act. Within 48 hours, they issued a public apology.